Hello, everybody. I'm here with Jason Eaton. I got I got a hold of him through his wife Michaela Eaton, which is an author and part of Fable Hive as well. And I found out that he is very has studied some of the classical philosophy and mythology as well. So I'm looking forward to have a conversation with him about that. So welcome, Jason. I'm looking forward to speaking about this stuff.
Yeah, hello. I'm Jason Eaton, as he said. I also am socially awkward, so I brought my good friend Yorick with me, just so I wouldn't feel like I was, alone. But I told Michaela I'd say that joke, and she's like, "That's so stupid," and so I had to say it.
Yeah. So one thing I want to go ahead and jump into is
Yeah,
a conversation we were already having before I started rolling this is the fact that the fact that mythology and stuff like that isn't arbitrary, and that Christianity, in a sense, fulfills all of the stories. And so, a lot of the records we have of old pagan myths and stuff, especially with the Vikings and things like that, only exist because of Christianity, because the Vikings and the pagans themselves didn't necessarily write these down. It was more of like a oral tradition that was passed down. And on top of that, you mentioned something about, idols and whether it's, demonic or real or not. And so if we can talk about that a little bit.
yeah, sure. I mean, well, one thing I'll say first about you're saying about the Vikings writing it down. Another interesting point is that there's sort of this myth. Ironically, we're talking about myths, but there's this myth in modern culture that Christianity supplanted or suppressed in some way pagan Rome or Greece and all these things, and they replaced. And in some cases, that was true a little bit, sort of by accident. Like I know a weird example of this is there's something that's called it's like the Archimedes palimpsest or something, and they scraped off like a text that included mathematical formulas. It would have been a precursor to calculus. And it was found in Egypt, and the Crusaders scraped it all off. Who needs math? And it ended up, I think it was the missile was put on it, something like that. So it happened by accident occasionally, but also the fact that these texts exist at all, not just in the Viking sense, the Prose Edda was written by a monk, I believe. I think Snorri, I think is his name. And so in the case of the Vikings, a lot of the Celtic myth was preserved, obviously by Catholics as well. But even in Roman and Greek sources, specifically in this case Latin sources, the Emperor Charlemagne was informed by one of his advisors that a lot of texts quoted by the Church Fathers or mentioned by the Church Fathers were becoming harder and harder to find. Cicero is quoted by St. Augustine a lot, right? For instance, one of the things instrumental to St. Augustine's conversion was Cicero's Hortensius, which actually we don't have. We do not have that work, unfortunately. And that was Cicero's introduction to philosophy. And so one of the things, a law that Charlemagne actually passed was that monasteries had to begin copying Latin pagan sources. And if they didn't have any in their library themselves, they had to reach out to neighboring monasteries to try to find texts to continue to translate so that these works would be preserved, because at the time everything was translated copied by hand, transcribed. And so if there wasn't anybody copying it down, then it wouldn't have been preserved. It would have just been completely lost. And another thing Charlemagne did too, just as an odd fact, is the handwriting of monks at the time was awful. So he passed a law standardizing the handwriting of the monks so that future generations would actually be able to continue to read it. And so a lot of when you look at medieval manuscripts and stuff, and there's this very rigorous, what would be the word I'm looking for? Anyway, very rigorous handwriting that stems from the laws, the reforms that he made and it's funny that you have a secular leader actually doing this in his empire. But then, with regards to the other point you were saying with idols or demons, It's not exactly where I thought you were going to start based on our conversation, but I guess it's an interesting one. All I was saying, I was just saying to you, was that there's two ways to look at the fact that the pagan world exists. So you have a world that's not Christian. I assume most of your viewers are Christian, so we'll just say that's the truth. We're putting that out there. But then there's there's this world out there who worships Zeus or Thor or Odin or, Amen or whatever Egyptian god of your choosing. And you can either say, well, these gods don't exist at all, and they're just made up, and they're worshipped by accident. And there's a case to be made for that, a little bit. And then there's also the side where you could say, well, they're demonic. They're worshiping Zeus is a demon. He might not be named Zeus. I don't know if the demons have names or not, but he identifies, at least to the people, as Zeus. And they're worshiping him as a demon. I mean, this is interesting because, biblically speaking, in one of the Psalms, I don't have the Psalms memorized. I'm not a Protestant. I don't have them all memorized by chapter and verse. But there's one Psalm specifically that says, the gods of the nations are idols. But then in the Septuagint, and I'm not sure about the Vulgate, but I know the Septuagint actually translates that as the gods of the nations are demons. So you sort of see in the biblical text, in two different editions of it, two different ways of viewing, because the Old Testament itself is very specific that the idols are, senseless. They can't move, they can't see, they can't do anything, but you worship this thing. But then you compare that with Greek texts or Roman even, and you have things like, well, that statue just moved, and that, thing. So you have both sides of whether they don't exist or they do exist. And I think there's cases to be made for both, quite frankly. I think it probably is both.
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the thought process, thought of the latter. You said that they do exist, because when people make things up from themselves, I feel like it falls apart very quickly. Like there's a sense of, it comes off as propaganda, where when you're not sure, like I can't imagine a group of people just sitting there and be like, let's create this story about this guy named Thor and lightning comes from him. I believe it's through our interactions with the world and our experience that these kind of, you can say, almost naturally came. And it's interesting because I mentioned this before. There's a perennial philosopher from France. His name is René Guénon. And one thing he says is that something like an idol, there's a sense of consciousness to that being or idol that you look at. So he put it as that when you have an idol, it becomes your storyteller, like your narrator for the world. And so when you look at, so let's say your idol is money, if you start learning about history and stuff, you only see it through the lens of money, right? So you can kind of see that in modern day, where it's mostly talked about like power structures and stuff, and so history is just broken down
right
through the lens of power.
Sorry to cut you off. It's like if you're a Marxist, you see everything under the lens of class struggle. If you're a feminist, you see everything under that. Yeah, I can kind of see what you mean by that. Yeah.
Yeah. So so I do believe that Thor, Anubis, all those you mentioned are you can say real gods to a certain extent, but I don't. I just view them as demonic because to me they seem to have weaponized the human want to worship or celebrate, but to like a lesser good instead of driving it to like the highest good, you can say, which is the God that we know in Christianity and Judaism. So
Yeah, no, I think I would say, I would answer what I meant when I said I think it can be both is I think we have to make something very clear when you're talking about pagan myths. And so one thing that's interesting about myths is that they aren't the production of any particular person, right? So we can't say, sometimes they are. We can be like, oh, Homer made up this god, right? But for the most part, we have no idea where the worship of Zeus came from, or Jupiter. We know a little bit. Archaeology's done some work on this with regards to what's usually referred to as like the Proto-Indo-European religion. And we know, so this explains basically just the names of the gods. So it's kind of interesting where you have like the highest god in, if we'll call it that, because I don't actually think this is true. We can talk about that in a little bit. But if the highest god in Greek mythology is Zeus, and the highest god in Roman mythology is Jupiter, you might say, well, linguistically, there's no connection between the name Jupiter and the name Zeus. But there is sort of when you do this archaeological study, because the name means father of the gods, Deu Pator, right? Father of the gods. So, and you see this in Zeus, because Greek is an inflected language. So you have like, nominative, genitive, and what have you. He's only named Zeus in the nominative. When you get into the genitive and the dative, he's Deo, right? So there's that god, like, right, the root of the word god. And then Jupiter is just putting the emphasis on the Pator part of father of the gods. But that's sort of a side issue. The other thing I was going to say about this was that there's the way it can be both is I think that I tend to fall, if I'm thinking about it myself, on, I don't know if you know this word, you probably do, I think it's euhemerism, named after Euhemerus. And he's a Greek thinker, and he was the one that thought that the gods were originally men. And you might say, well, that's a little silly that they would divinize men. But the point being, these are men of very, very primitive culture. And a very, very primitive time, like before they had recorded history. And then over time, people that were heroic became gods, and then people became... But then at the other side of it, I guess there's going to be 3 points here. So then the second point being, I think that's where the names of the gods sort of came from. That's where they started. That's where they sort of... But then you have, and this is something we touched on a little bit in our conversation prior to talking, I think this is where mythology as philosophy comes in, because the fact that we worship Zeus, the fact that we worship Hermes or Apollo or all these things, it might be a historical accident. We'll never know because it's prior to recorded or oral history. We have no idea where the name came from, what it means. But then the mythographers came in, the guys that wrote myths, mythopoesis, right, the making of myth. And these guys started saying, okay, well, what does this god represent? Or what does he, how did he get here? And this is where we start getting, I would say, the idea of like recorded myth, right? Zeus is the god and his wife was Hera, and they gave birth to Ares and Apollo and Artemis and all of these different gods. This is when we can say, like, this is what we would call like pagan religion systematized. And then I think the third point being, I think there is a demonic aspect to it insofar as if you read ancient history, it's pretty evident that they're getting responses from something, right? Like I'm not a skeptic enough to say, oh, it was all just, they just thought that this is what was happening. Like, no, they're obviously like statues would bleed, or there's the Pythian Apollo famous, or oracle, sorry, it's Apollo shrine, but so you have all these things where they're telling prophecies, they're saying all these things, and it's like, this isn't explainable through a purely natural causation. It does seem to be that there is something supernatural going on. So I think there's sort of 3 steps that we need to identify. The origin of the myth itself, which we may never know, right? And then the systematizing of the myth, which would be the work of the mythographers, those that actually, the mythology as philosophy. And then the third point would be sort of the worship itself, right? Like, I'm Zeus, worship me. Well, that's obviously demonic, right? So I think those would be the sort of the 3 stages in pagan mythology and religion. And they're all worth studying because they all can have sort of different things that we can learn or consider about them. But that would be how I would respond to you anyway.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because you said, they clearly were getting something. And, there's no mistake that a lot of them were, people don't like talking about this, but a lot of them were asking for blood. I mean, the majority of these pagan rituals.
Human sacrifices is something that's very glossed over among the when you talk about classical literature, I know in ancient Rome, a man was sacrificed on the Capitoline Hill for years, and everyone just sort of sanitizes the fact that human sacrifice. The Vikings were notorious for human sacrifices, usually raping people before they sacrificed them. I know there was a very famous Viking funeral, the boat funerals, that everyone sort of looks back on as something glorious and cool that the Vikings did. Well, the servant girls of the king that was going to be killed would be passed around to all the lords under the Viking king and then murdered and burnt on his boat. And we're like, oh yeah, they're so cool, these Vikings, or they're so cool. No, yeah, the idea that not only did they require the sacrifice of blood, meaning, animals, like some of them would require 100 cows to be killed. But I mean, we can't really criticize that because the ancient Israelites also had animal sacrifices, though there is a relation there a little bit. But yeah, no, the sacrifice of human blood specifically is usually glossed over. I mean, the fact that the classics are sanitized, like look at most depictions of ancient Greece or ancient Rome in movies or TV shows, and the streets are clean. Like the streets aren't clean. This is Rome. One of the only shows that actually does it fairly well, I think, was HBO's Rome, and it's HBO. Sure, there's probably sex, so be careful if you watch it. I don't actually remember, but it definitely, like, Rome's dirty and Rome's brutal and Rome, like, it's. But we often sanitize that because we want to with sort of make this lie that everything was great and then Christianity come and then look, we're in the Middle Ages and it's horrid, right? So
yeah, and the thing is that, I think we have a tendency in the modern day to also elevate ourselves higher than the people of the past, as if we're outside of those patterns just because we have a cell phone in our pocket. But, a lot of, especially more secular people, are falling to the same patterns where, people don't like to talk about this. But for example, something like abortion is like what's it called? A blood sacrifice in the same way that, the Aztecs or somebody else would do in the past. And, the reasoning is usually like, oh, it's because my education is important, or, my free time or my body. But all of those you can, in the same way, say that those are idols or gods or what have you, just because you view it as education. I mean, Greeks had a goddess of education, you can say, too, and they gave something up for it. Like, all these things ask something of you, and they require it. If I'm making sense with what I'm trying to communicate.
No, of course. Sorry, I know you told me to wait a few seconds after you responded,
Okay.
But no, I see what you mean. There is actually, you could say we're worse. You could say we're worse. You could say we're better in that specific regard. Because, I mean, the Bible, for instance, has a specific deity mentioned, demon, Molech. And the demon Molech would require sacrifices of babies. And they would, not only would it require sacrifices of babies, it was an incredibly gruesome sacrifice of a baby. Where it was a bronze statue with its hands out like this, and you would put the baby on it, and then you would light a fire underneath, and the baby would be cooked. And what's almost worse about this sacrifice is not only you're burning a baby, which is absolutely disgusting, but there would be people singing and chanting. And the reason there were people singing and chanting is because if the parents of the baby cried, the sacrifice was deemed to be not favorable to Molech, and it wouldn't count. And so they would have these singers so the parents wouldn't be able to hear the baby crying. And you can relate that to abortion, obviously, because, well, we clearly killed them before we can hear them scream. But on the one sense, it's worse in the modern era because we're sacrificing them to ourselves, right? Most of the sacrifices that we make is to exalt ourselves. You could say, sure, they're worshiping demons, but at least they're not worshiping themselves. Arguably ours is worse because we're more entrapped, because who's a greater, who's a more equal enemy to us, a demon or ourselves? Well, the demon's stronger than us, but if the demons can just convince us to worship ourselves, we'll never stop. Because look how great I am. Like, I'm wonderful, right? Whereas if we're worshiping them, at least It's possible for God, as he does in history, to replace that worship with the worship of the real God. But if we're worshiping ourselves, what do we replace that with? Right? So to deny ourselves and carry our cross is a lot harder to do than to just switch who I'm denying myself for. Right? So the pagans at least have a leg up on us in that regard. But they still had some brutal things that they did, like far we could even not even conceive of doing.
Yeah, the thing with that too is that I feel because the pagans had, you can say, a sort of, if I can say, reverence, like they had understanding of the power that they were worshiping, right? So
Right.
I like to compare it as like, if this demon was a giant beast, to a certain extent they had it chained and they fed it appropriately, whereas now, through the worship of ourselves, these demons, you can say, or these entities, are almost running rampant, and they just choose who they eat at random. So an example I like to give is, for example, if someone's at these, let's say, like a big techno concert or whatever, it's a form of worship in a sense, because everybody is geared towards the DJ, you can say, and the ritual is to dance, to have a good time and stuff. And most of the times, people take drugs or whatever, but at the end of the day, like that, you can say that party claims somebody's life, right? Like, whether someone dies from a drug overdose, or like we had in the past with certain concerts, people getting trampled, it's almost like, it still requires a sacrifice, and if you don't give it what it requires, it's just going to eat somebody, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but then I guess you just get into I would the only reason I would say I kind of disagree with that is it would get into the idea that like a sacrifice has to be intentional. You can't say that, and same with worship. Like you can't really, I can't accidentally worship something, right? Like I can
Well, I
value.
don't think I don't think it's necessarily accidental. I just don't think we realize that we're worshiping. Because I think even something like an act of worship lives on a, you can say, in a certain sense, in like a hierarchy, where, like, you can go to a church and worship, which is like the highest form of it, but then there's lower forms of it, where people gathering together at a concert or something like that is, in a sense of, you're not necessarily worshiping. You can say maybe a high entity like a god, but you're celebrating something.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I would just only I just don't understand. I guess I just don't see the connection between to celebrate something and to worship something because, I mean, we celebrate Remembrance Day in Canada. I think you guys have Memorial Day, but it's not it's not worshiping the dead. It's venerating or honoring the dead, but it's not. Um, and again, it's not. I would say like worship requires a conscious sacrifice of something. And so when we worship ourselves, it just means we're sacrificing. We're putting ourselves. Well, it requires, I guess, two things. To worship something, you need to say this is the highest good, um, and therefore I will give whatever I need to this higher good. Right? I would say that would be sort of the bare minimum to say. Now, of course, it gets complicated when you have multiple things that you worship, and we all do. But it requires that at least like this thing is a good and I'm going to give to it. But if I go to a concert, it's not necessarily worship because music is good. So you could say I worship music to a certain extent, but the fact that somebody dies at a rock concert, let's say, is not. That's an accident of the fact that someone gets trampled is not a. Now you might say there's demonic interference, and that's getting beyond my scope. I'm not, going to say that that's true or not, but it's not true that it is an act of sacrificial worship. Like, I think a sacrificial worship there would need to be an intent there. I think in order to make sense of it. Maybe there are demons preying on rock concerts. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I guess what I'm trying to, because, okay, so for example, the most recent one that was like a tragedy was that Travis Scott concert that happened, I think, last year or 2 years
yeah,
ago.
something like that.
And I mean,
Like, didn't the
when
didn't
he
the
went up on
podium
stage,
break or
he
something?
Was that?
Didn't the seats collapse or something like that, or did someone? Maybe I'm thinking about something else.
No, I believe there was just so many people there that
Okay,
sometimes when
okay,
somebody fell, they just got trampled to death.
right,
But he had, um, he came out and he said that the single only thing that's important at this concert was to get lit, which was like to have a good time, right? And so you have so like there's different. So if you go to a concert, it's kind of understood like, all right, we're here to have a good time, but we have these set of rules to kind of like make sure that it doesn't get out of control. But
right.
he automatically, you can say, like, I don't want to overuse the term sacrifice, but he trampled the whole structure and said the only thing is to have a good time, right? And so like that's in a way the idol or the demon right there. It was like that's it, right? But in a sense, so at that point, there was no offering of other things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a life. Like there was no offering of like, I'm going to step back of having a good time just a little bit in order for someone else to have one too. It was like, no, and so in that case, in a certain sense, it required a blood ritual because you got rid of all other forms of sacrifice, if that makes sense.
Sure, that could be. I guess I don't know. I don't even know who Travis Scott is, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
So maybe it's the case. I just think it's a little bit. I don't know. The way I would look at it, and this I would relate back to classical mythology, is I don't think the demons have to get involved in secular culture very much because why would they need to? I think there's a Fulton Sheen line that's really great. Is that the Satan doesn't need to tempt the man that doesn't believe in Satan. The man's already on his side, right? And so the same idea I would say to this. It's like with secular man, in the ancient world, we were impressed by the supernatural. And so Satan had to respond with a supernatural answer to that need, right? In today's society, we deny the supernatural, so Satan just gets to sit back and drink mimosas. Like, it's easy. We're already on his side, right? So I would say maybe you're right. I'm not trying to say you're wrong. Like I said, I don't even know who this guy is. And I know Satan is at work in our society and our culture and all of these things. Absolutely. He always has been. But to put it in that such harsh language, especially when people are just trying to have fun and people have tragically died, I think is a bit like too specific, if you know what I mean. Like it's a bit too like this is the cause of this. It's like, well, yeah, but by that logic, God is the cause of it because he's the first cause of all things, right? We would never say that. And in the same way, I don't think it's fair to attribute to Satan accidental things that, well, yes, is maybe pleasing to him. I'm sure it was, but he's not the immediate cause of that thing. That's all I would mean by that. And so to relate it back to classical myth, where I think the demons were actively involved, the parallel doesn't really fit because it's not like Apollo appears to man and says, do these things, or like when he shoots the Trojans with poison, or I guess it would be the Greeks, but the Greeks with poison arrows. Like it's attributed directly to Apollo. It's not just, yeah, we got sick, right? And we say, oh, well, Satan was behind it. If you get the difference that I'm trying to say, I think, well, you're probably right. Like, don't get me wrong. I just think it's too. I think in humility we have to say we just don't know, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah, for sure. Sometimes I try to, I have. It stems back, not to get too deep into this one example, because I would like to definitely go into more in depth of the importance of stories and myth. But I think we also there's a sense of a misunderstanding of something like free will, for example. So I view free will as not necessarily of being able to do what you want, but the only decision we really have is you're either with God or you're not,
right.
right? And so in that sense, I view that a lot of these, you can say, principalities, whether they be angelic or demonic, have a lot more input in how we behave than we necessarily think, right? So there's a lot of like microtransactions we have of whether we choose God or not, what you
Right.
can say of, and that puts us one way or the other. I mean, an example of that is the icon of the ladder of divine ascent, right? So, you're with God, so you're climbing the ladder to get to the top. And while people are trying to climb, there's these demons and stuff trying to pull people down. And so with that, that's kind of like, I guess what I'm trying to communicate a little bit is like, if you're against God, you're more likely to fall into, you can say, like this accidental worship of a principality you don't know exists, because you've made the decision that I don't want the freedom that God provides for me. So it kind of opens a thing of like other principalities to come in and be like, okay, well, you're just going to worship me now.
Well, right. Well, that I can totally agree with. I mean, I think definitely in that regard, it's it feels awful to say, but it does at least appear to be, in my understanding, a binary choice. Like you are you're either with God or against God, and it does, when you're against Him, you do open yourself up to demonic influence, and so in that regard, I definitely think that's true. But again, I think it does. It's human free will is designed so that we can freely choose God, and when we don't, we therefore open ourselves up to demonic action. But it's equally our fault, right? It's equally, and so
Yeah.
it's not to scare anybody. Like the demons are going to get you; they're going to rip off your face. Yeah, it's subtle. I mean, I wish I could look into the spiritual realm and see it. It wouldn't make much sense because they would just be a bunch of intellects sitting around floating there. But yeah, I mean, I said this to Michaela the other day, or actually, do you know what? I think she said this to me. I was like, it'd be interesting to go to the grocery store and to see the spiritual realm. Your guardian angel's just like running through a demon, and then like that other demon like conquers that guy. It's like, obviously that's a more metaphorical way to put it. It would be an interesting thing to see, because yeah, I mean, they have a job to do, right? They have a job to do, and the demons have their jobs to do, and they're constantly doing it, and we'll never see it. At the final judgment, maybe we'll get a glimpse of it. But currently we can't see it, and so we can only sort of guess at what's
Yeah, I think
involved.
the best we can see it is through pattern. Like I would say that someone that suffers through an addiction, you can say, is enslaved by something, clearly, because he can't stop doing what he may want to stop it, but it's hard,
Right.
right? Like you can't. So just shifting the conversation a little bit. So, we discussed this early on, but if a lot of these pagan myths and stuff are just a bunch of hocus pocus, why would the church fathers or early Christians ever want to save them? Like, why would they record these myths to? Why wouldn't they just let them, you could say, disappear into the ethos with it?
Right. Yeah, so I think this is where I get into the second part of myth that I was talking about when I sort of broke it down into the three. The mythopoesis is the writing of myths, so myths as philosophers, and so this is where you kind of get into the way that myth was interpreted by, excuse me, the pagans themselves, and by going forward, the various, the early church fathers and all these people, is that there's a side of the myths where they're obviously, it's not just the worshiping of demons, it's not just this. There's a written story and structure that was added by man, maybe, or maybe again, like we don't know who wrote the myths to begin with. Where did they come from? But yeah, there all is this sort of value in myths as a man-made. You shouldn't say man-made. That makes it sound like it's, but like a recorded history. Like once myth became recorded, is when we sort of start to see their value. There's the artistic value. Like Homer's really fun to read, and he's got really cool analogies. He's really good at analogies. Hesiod's boring and like just lists names. So some of them are fun, some of them aren't. Some of them have artistic value, some of them don't. But they do have value. On the one hand, as like historical documents, but they also have value just like as expressions of human examples of human understanding that are worth like living in. I guess that's kind of a weird way to put it, but like we can mentally put ourselves into Hesiod's worldview or the world of Virgil, and we can experience mentally at least what that would be like and what the gods are like, and we can actually learn things from that because human beings did in fact live in that world. right? So there is the value there. And so, yeah, we can, I'll go back to you, but yeah, it would be, that's an interesting conversation to have, because they're not just, oh, look, they worship demons and it's evil, right? There is something valuable that's contained.
Yeah, I think that, they're important because I think now with like modern scientism and, you can say the four horsemen of apocalypse, those atheist characters gave us such a materialistic view of the way we view everything that we say that, like I mentioned earlier with the dragons, like we read Medusa and we say, well, there's clearly no snake woman with snake hair, so
I don't
it's just like
know.
a fun story kind of thing, right? And so, but um but we, as Christians and Catholics specifically, we know that there's like we were discussing before, that there's a invisible element and consciousness, you can say, that we interact with. And something like Medusa, which I've recently been kind of like reading a lot about myself and stuff, is such a mysterious character. But if you think about it, Medusa is kind of like just usually serpents or snakes are associated with change, like time. And so it's this extreme form of change, so much like absolute chaos, so much so that if you look at it, you freeze, right? Like, from your experience, if you experience change way too much, or even something you can't handle to a certain extent, you like you need a moment to recognize what's happening. And I think some of these stories that's what it's trying to lay out, is kind of like, I guess, more of the invisible opposed to like this forensic materialism of like, this is how it, like the way we understand science, modern day.
Right. Yeah. So I guess this is actually a great example for me to say what I meant. I should have just said it at the beginning, but no. To explore a little bit more what I meant. So I think, while you say, oh, there's no snake woman that exists. Okay, yeah, probably not. But I do think that with the origin of myths, like prior to them being recorded, like prior to human history as we know it, I would say, like Hercules is a great example of this, or Heracles in the Greek. What does he do? He goes around and kills a bunch of monsters. Like there's the Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, there's those meat-eating horses, and there's this like flock of birds. I think they also eat human flesh. There's these weird monsters that he goes and kills for the most of his labors. There's one when he has to like clean out a stable. There's weird stuff he has to do. But most of them involve killing monsters. And a lot of Greek, like Theseus, same idea. Like at one point he has to like wrestle some dude, and he kills monsters. And so if you kind of break it down, you're like, okay, let's look beyond like what's actually being said. These great heroes. And you're like, okay, well, they killed wild beasts and they beat up bandits, right? That's probably what made them famous, because the world was chaotic and lawless and, barely civilized. And if there was a lion next door to your village, it was probably wreaking havoc. And so a man that went out and killed it was probably going to be worshipped. Like, that's a great thing that you did for our village. Like, here, take all of our, like, kiss my baby kind of thing. And I think that's like, I'm not saying this is where that myth originated. I'm just hypothesizing here that I think, and you see this in a lot of different cultures where like heroes, especially not so much the gods, but the heroes, like Hercules is a hero, Perseus who kills Medusa is a hero. So he's sort of like he's above us mortals, but he's not quite a god. It's like he's also below a demigod. Some of them are like a demigod's usually like a half god, but anyway, these heroes usually kill wild monsters. And I said to Michaela, I said, I think these wild monsters, I think they did exist. I think there might have been, like your point about dragons. Well, I think dragons, maybe they did exist. And by dragons, I just mean not a flying lizard, but like big snakes. Because, I mean, even in history, like we have a Roman historian wrote in Greek, was Diodorus Siculus, and he records a snake that was captured by one of the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. And this snake could like kill 2 cavalrymen in one go. The snake was so enormous. And it's like, well, that's a friggin' dragon, right? Like or these huge pythons that we find in Caribbean, I guess not Caribbean, but like, Pacific Islands and all these different places. And these snakes are huge. If you saw one of these snakes, you'd be like, that is a mythical monster, and I'm afraid of it, right? And then if you had men killing these monsters, you would, so to your point, I think, and so I'm going to get to your point about the spiritual side of it, but I think physically there's the side of it being like, okay, these monsters existed and men killed them. But then you have the other fact, which is that, okay, well, why are all the monsters that Hercules kills like one-off monsters? It's not just he went off and killed lions or he went off and killed hydras. It's the Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra. I think there's some famous boar they kill. But they're all named usually off the places. So why are they one-off monsters? And so I think this is where the writing of myth comes in. It's like, okay, we have these oral stories of Hercules killing these monsters, and they sort of grew into, and then someone, Homer or Hesiod, or probably people before them, started to concretize these stories into monsters that were symbolic, right? And I'm not going to say I know what the symbolism is. I mean, the Hydra cut off its head, 2 more grow back. I don't know what that symbol is. It probably stemmed from some dude killing a snake sometime. I hope. I hope there's not Hydras running around and we just don't know about it. But the spiritual part of it, or the invisible or the metaphorical part of it, of that story, is added by human beings, I think, when they start recording these myths and writing them down. And there was an intentional part to it. There was an intentional aspect or an intentionality to them picking what stories was going to be told, what did Hercules do? Why is it 12 labors as opposed to 7? Or why is it this as opposed to this? And that's when the actual recording, once the recording of the histories or a more concretized oral tradition started to become about, I do think that there was the intent to symbolize certain things or certain truths in these stories that might have had a more like archaic, like dude killed a snake one time origin. I think the more specific details were added later.
Interesting. I see. I see what you're coming from. There's other people like Jordan Peterson that say similar things, that something like snakes in particular were one of humanity's first, you can say, natural predators or enemies that we had to combat against. But I do believe that that's kind of like I think there was a different language that people talk to in terms of like how we viewed the world, right? So, best example I can give is the way we experience the world. The world is more flat than it is round. Water is wet and not H2O, and you don't experience necessarily the Earth Earth rotating around the sun. To you, the sun comes up and then goes down, and that's where you wake up. And when when it's dark out, that's when you go to sleep, right? So it's like it's like a more through the human experience. And the thing is, I don't, when people say like the human experience, they automatically think of this arbitrariness to it. Like, like when you hear some of these people that say like, I'm spiritual, but not religious. But, there's nothing arbitrary about the experience that if you drink salt water, you're going to die. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's still rooted in a truth. It's just that, what's it called? We're the intellect, you can say, that experiences the world and why it exists. And I think that's what these stories are trying to represent in a way, like saying, like I said, with Medusa being like this absolute form of chaos, and Perseus, how does he defeat her? He looks at her reflection, right? Like he's able to give her an identity without freezing. And through it, after he cuts off her head, like Pegasus and that other one come out, right? And Pegasus, you can say, is like this, this new knowledge, this higher principality, because it has like wings of an angel and it's a horse, right? So he gets a reward to a certain extent. There's a reward for conquering that chaos. And so I think initially when these stories were written, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if it wasn't necessarily just because man killed lion or anything like that. It was more of an experience of like, like the dragon could have been a mob that was raiding a town, but they wrote it in the sense of it was a dragon, right? Like it was this giant beast, I guess you can say. It's the way I look at it, because some of what you mentioned, I think, is like materialism trying to rationalize the weirdness of the myth, I guess you can say.
I think you agree with me, and you just focused on one side of what I was trying to say as opposed to the other. All I was trying to say is there is an important aspect of the myths, which is that the Hydra itself probably did not exist, right? I agree with you actually. I mean, everything you said, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly. I totally think that. I think the because that's why I say there's the second part of myth, the part where myth and philosophy, as I think I said to you, I might not have said it on the recorded part of this, but um, Aristotle, and then even Thomas Aquinas follows him in this, that philosophy is the earliest form, or sorry, mythology is the earliest form of philosophy, is exactly what I think you were trying to express, and exactly what I meant, where the man's written contribution to mythology is. So we've gone from just, all I was trying to say is we've gone just beyond, well, we venerate this guy because he killed a snake one time, to now we're going to try to write this. This is this cool story we've inherited. Let's sort of add meaning to it. It's because it's kind of silly to sit there and be like, okay, well, kill the snake, who cares? But what the mythographers were trying to do, they were what they were doing. As Aristotle points out, and Thomas Aquinas follows him in this, is that they understood the truth but didn't know how to express it, and so all I meant by saying Hercules was a guy that killed snakes one time, or lions, or what have you, was that they took the name Hercules to be the example of the person that does this metaphorical thing or symbolic thing, because that was what had sort of been handed down to them historically. And then they would add these details. So it's not just Hercules was some dude that killed wild beasts, but Hercules was the guy that killed the Lernaean Hydra. And that Hydra represents this various thing. And they didn't necessarily say it represents this various thing because they didn't know how, right? They didn't know. I know a big theme you see, like if you look at Hesiod, or if you go into like Near Eastern cultures, like the Enuma Elish, is like the creation myth of the Babylonians, and various other texts. The Egyptians have really weird ones, but those you see, like, it's chaos at the beginning. Like literally in Hesiod, chaos is the first god that exists. And then you have all the various things that come out. And then it's a slow, like brutal war that eventually leads to the reign of Zeus and justice and all of these things and order. The world is, the universe is ordered. And in Babylon, you have like Tiamat is this ancient deity that's like every other god is birthed from this Tiamat. And then Marduk eventually comes along and he kills her, and then he creates the world from her bones and the streams from her eyes and like all these different things. But again, he's bringing order to this chaotic world. And so I think that's what you would say, what you're getting at is this written side of things. All I was trying to say is that there's also an important point that the myths are true even from a skeptical or secular perspective. Like, I believe 100% that people like Odysseus, Achilles, Hercules, all of these great men, Aeneid or Aeneas from the Aeneid, they all existed. They were all real people. I totally believe that Odysseus sailed around, the ocean, and I guess it was just the Mediterranean at the time. But he thought he was traveling all around all these places. Because why wouldn't I believe it? Like, just because they're mythological doesn't mean they're not real, right? And there's a very great risk, I think, in saying that, well, that's just a myth. So it's important to say, on the one hand, the myths are true, literally. Like, I believe that Hercules killed a giant snake, and he killed a lion, and he killed all these things. But then also, the myths symbolize, especially when you start getting into the myths of the gods, they symbolize various realities that mankind experiences but can't quite express. And so I think all I was trying to say, which is why I thought it was funny, because you said exactly what I thought I meant. But yeah, that was all I was sort of trying to express.
Yeah, the reason I get kind of, as you can tell, maybe protective of that, because I feel like sometimes that used to explain it away, right? Like,
yes,
I feel like there's a sense of, that it's just about a guy killing a snake. Like, there's nothing to this story, and what's it called? I mean, and then lastly, to wrap up, I want to connect it a little bit to the biblical stories, because obviously there's a huge mythical language there too. I mean, you have it in Revelation, a lot of it in the Old Testament, you have it in Genesis. So, there must be something to that language that even, where me and you believe that the truth of all truth uses that same mythical language.
Well, right. I mean, I think that's definitely true. I mean, you see this. It's funny that you point out you can. People will say, "Oh, it's just a guy killed a snake," and that can be used to discount the myth. Well, it goes both ways, though, because I mean, you see liberal biblical scholars point to Origen, the church father, and he has a very like allegorical interpretation of the book of Joshua. And so you'll hear liberal biblical scholars say, well, therefore the book Origen thought the book of Joshua isn't historical. It's allegorical. It's like that's not true at all. Right? And there's a risk. You see this also in the I can't remember which pope made it, but it's the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and they looked into like modern biblical interpretation. But one of the last ones that they asked was on the historicity of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and they warned people specifically against saying that these books aren't historical. Now, they're not historical, or these chapters. These chapters aren't historical according to modern history, but they acknowledge that there's a fear of saying, well, if you say they're not historical, people will mean they're not historical at all, right? There's no value to them. If they're just myth, then there's nothing there. So it goes both ways. You can be protective of myth, but you also can be protective of the truth that underlies the myth. And by saying that it's mythological, and I think that's what, we didn't really get a chance to talk about it, but I think that's what the later philosophers were doing when they were talking about myths and interpreting them in like metaphysical causality. It was a big thing that they tried to interpret the myths under. They were trying to say, like, yes, these are mythological, but just because they're myths doesn't mean they're not true, right? Like, look at the ways in which the texts themselves indicate that it's not meant to be interpreted literally. Like, a big one would be like, Zeus is called the father of gods and men. It's like, but there's a ton of gods that aren't. Zeus isn't their father, right? So how can he be this? So obviously, it's like, well, you have to. It sort of begs you to interpret the myth in a certain way, because if that's literally true, that statement, which I think Hesiod thinks it should be because he repeats it multiple times, then parts of the story can't be true, but that doesn't also mean it's not true, right? So when you can be protective, you have to be protective in both ways, because you are right, because there's a tendency to say, well, the biblical narrative it's just a myth among myths, right? It's just, and therefore people can say, well, you can just as easily discount it as I can. I don't think Marduk made the world out of the bones of Tiamat. Well, I can just as easily say, well, I don't think God said, let there be light, and there was light, right? It's just as easily mythologically interpreted. Of course, that's wrong, because I think if you read one account and you read the other account, the differences should be evident. But for a lot of very educated people, it's not evident, because they've convinced themselves that the biblical narrative is just another myth. It's just another mythology. So it goes both ways, and there is no stronghold really in the middle. I don't think. I think it's up to the whims of whatever individual. I don't think it's really. We just have to say this is true and then hope people believe us.
Yeah, no, I mean, the last thing I'm going to say to, this is, it's also like, I mean, this is what you were saying. It's within each text or each story requires a certain lens to where to read, right? So if you approach, for example, something with the Bible, I use this term a lot with like I'm looking for forensic evidence. You might find some, but then at the same time, there's other languages being used there that you're not going to find what you're looking for, right? So
Right.
if you're purely looking through that lens, and you have Christ saying something like, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and if you're saying, of course he's not a bunch of these photons, looking light, but that's not the light he means. Like, it's the experience, it's like the experience of how you're looking at light, right? Like, it's
Right.
light reveals something to you in the darkness, and that's the language he was using, is like,
Right.
he is the light, but not in the photons, like photon
Well,
senses, in the sense
an
of like,
example of that. An example of that would be an example I learned from. One of my university professors actually brought this up, and it was kind of an interesting point, and I've never forgot it. He was a very imperfect man, but it was a very good observation. He said, why is it that the highest god in most religions wields thunderbolts? You might say, well, I don't know, because they do a lot of damage. And his point was very, very, I think, elucidating, which was just that Well, the highest god in most religions wields a thunderbolt, and even the god of the Old Testament is often described as throwing his arrows or javelins or what have you, which obviously is a reference to thunderbolt. Because mentally, the truth is often experienced as a sort of like enlightening of the mind, right? And I don't know that that's true. I don't know that that's actually why he yields the thunderbolt, but I'm inclined to believe it's true because it makes a lot of sense, right? Once you express it that way, you're like, wow, that is true. Like often you feel when you experience the truth, and really not just like, oh yeah, that's probably true, but when you actually are like, oh my goodness, it's like everything else is enlightened by that truth, right? It's like a burst of thunder or lightning, I guess, burst of lightning. And so I'll probably never forget that, and it's probably true, right? In terms of what we're talking about, that these myths and these gods, they're not just, well, they probably were demons, many of them, but they didn't start that way. When people started writing them down, there were these truths that were trying to be told, and just as the lightning bolt enlightens the mind, so too these myths can often enlighten us, especially when we want to go back and see. Like it's so interesting to go back and see, like, these people weren't anti-Christian; they just were pre-Christian, and they had so much truth there, and that's interesting to go back and look at.
Yeah, and then what's it called? The lightning bolt also commands attention, right? Like, so if you see lightning and you hear it, that you're gonna look in that direction, or whatever you're doing at that time, you're gonna notice it.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're approaching an hour here, so I'm gonna go ahead and I can keep talking about this stuff forever because I love talking about it. I'll probably have you on again at another time if you're up for it.
I was about to say there was so much stuff that we talked about before we started that I did not even get a chance to talk on, or touch on. So yeah, if you ever want, if you're just like, I don't have anybody to come on my podcast, I think it's fun. So yeah, just let me know.
Yeah, no, this is a blast. But thank you for coming on, and I'm looking forward to having another conversation with you at some time. But once again, thank you for this.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thanks a lot.
If you enjoyed the content here on my channel, please like and subscribe. And if you would like to learn more, I have a blog on my website where you can learn more about symbolism, as well as short form videos and articles on my Instagram page. Thank you for listening, and I hope you tune into the next one.